Hello, everyone. Before we dive into the mock interview assignment, I want to take a moment to explain why this assignment matters and why I am doing it this way. So, just a couple of things. More and more interviews are happening over Zoom or Microsoft Teams. They're not being done across a desk. And that changes how questions are asked. That question changes how these answers that you as the applicant give are received and how you're being evaluated. So being able to clearly explain your experience, give concrete examples, and stay focused on the question is more important now than ever in this semi-virtual world that we're working in, especially with health information management. Even with direct patient care positions, we're finding that the first cut on the interviews is done over Zoom. And more of our sites for HIM are asking for the opportunity to interview applicants so they can get a feel for them when they're having them in their co-op. So as I was looking for relevant material to share with you, I came across this presentation that I did a few years ago for the Lane County Medical Society. They asked for me to be a guest speaker as I've had several years, in fact, more years than I prefer to count, as a hiring manager. And then, of course, since hiring managers are employees, I also have experience interviewing for positions. So this presentation that you're going to get is one that's going to help you prepare from both sides. While originally intended for a hiring manager, it's also the best way I know of to get ready for an actual interview. So I hope you enjoy it. Um, it'll help you with both how to write more effective interview questions and then how to respond to them. So I hope you get a lot out of it. So let's get started and go to the presentation. Okay, this is on more effective interviewing. So I'm not going to spend you a little bit of, I'm going to just get after it and talk about some of the things. A little bit about my background for those of you who don't know me. I spent many years working at Kaiser Permanente and several managerial health information roles within Kaiser, including department management, ambulatory Medicare finance, and the Division of Research. I've also worked as an adjunct instructor at City College of San Francisco and Los Angeles, Mission College. And again, more about my experience. I've had a lot of experience in management, medical record abstracting, all types of HIM. Started dabbling in natural language processing when I worked in research, a member of the American Health Information Management Association and the Oregon Health Information Management Association. Couple of disclaimers, right? Quick important notes. This content focuses on best practices for effective interviewing, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of it for your mock interviews. It's not legal advice. It's intended only to be informational. It's not to substitute for either HR consultation, legal advice, or anything like that. And the presentation is not going to talk about any specific solutions regarding EEO complaints or any type of legal advice whatsoever. Again, I'm not a lawyer. For any legal advice about EEO employment practices, please consult an. Okay, some things that we're going to talk about in this presentation include why interviewing applicants is so difficult. In a lot of ways, it's even more difficult than being interviewed. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why past behavior is the best predictor of future performance and how you can use that to your advantage as an applicant. We're going to talk about steps for effective interviewing. We're going to talk about open-ended and closed-ended questions. And then we're going to talk about the importance of asking and answering job-related questions. And then we'll talk about some examples, how hiring managers make a decision and move on. And you can do the walkthrough exercises. I'm just going to save them for you to do with your interview applicant and go from there. So why is interviewing applicants so difficult in this day and age? One, we have to interview people with different skill sets than ourselves, right? Even if you're working in a field, you're a nursing manager hiring nurses, it's not the same as actually doing it. And many times management is actually a few years removed from doing direct HIM task or doing direct patient care. Some applicants may be great fits for organizations, but they just don't interview well. Interviewing well is an acquired skill, and it takes some time to do that, particularly if you're going to be doing the first cut online. Some applicants interview well, but they're not real great fits. And the same job title has different responsibilities. Even in HIM, coders, billers mean different levels of skill in different organizations. And again, it's no surprise to all of us that some applicants exaggerate their skills on a resume. So a lot of things going on at the same time. So what are the steps to effective interviewing? Well, these don't just happen by accident, they're planned. The first step is to analyze the actual job, not just the job title, but look at what the job's actually going to be doing. Hopefully, this is in the job posting. And then we need to plan open-ended questions based on your relevant past work experience. And we'll talk about what that exactly means in a little bit. And then during the interview, take notes, get specific answers, and ask follow-up questions. Let the applicant speak. You want to maintain control of the interview. Again, part of what you're testing for in an interview is you're making sure that somebody is actually following instructions and answering your questions. And interviews, at least a great way to get that initially out of the way. So then after the interview, you want to evaluate the interview. Evaluation's critical. You want to make the hiring decision if you're the hiring manager, and it should never be based on a gut decision. I don't trust any manager who says, I just feel it in my gut. Feelings are not objective. Feelings are not based on data. Feelings come and go. Your feelings will change if you hire the wrong person. So, first thing is to analyze the job, whether you're interviewing for it or you're going to apply for it. And that means ask yourself, why does the position exist? Does the organization still need this position? What are they going to be doing in your office? What traits, behaviors, knowledge, and skills are needed for the position? Right? Even with such things as coders, we all assume that coding is all the same. There's definitely a difference between hospital-based coding and medical-based coding, or coding in an academic medical center like OHSU or UC San Francisco versus Peace Health Riverbend. So the other thing to think about, how much training are you willing to do, whether you're the hiring manager or the applicant? Are they expecting to come in and somebody to basically be fully functional straight away? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. So then we want to ask open-ended questions based on relevant past work experience. Take a look at what you're looking at and decide what type of open-ended question based on their experience. And often we as hiring managers know what we want, but we don't put it in specific open-ended questions based on past experience, right? And we got some examples coming up. Here's one. We want somebody, say, who is a bedside nurse to have good interpersonal skills. We can ask something like, are you good with people? I've never met anybody who says they're not good with people, right? It's more effective to ask, can you tell me about a specific instance where you had to interact with a difficult patient and how the issue was resolved? That's a much better way to get it. And then hopefully the applicant answers the question in a meaningful way where you can make your own judgment. Here's another example. The same thing applies to technical skills. We're looking for somebody with good EHR skills. We can ask either, are you good with electronic health record systems? And somebody who is a receptionist at a clinic can say, sure, I know how to register people. It doesn't really tell you a whole lot. It's much more meaningful to say, can you describe for me what type of electronic health record systems you use? How hard did you find it to learn this system? And again, what you want to do as the applicant, in my experience, is to answer questions based on past experience. So people will ask you open-ended questions based on past work experience, at least we hope they do. And if they don't, answer their question by tying it to something based on past experience. Sometimes an applicant gives a general kind of trait answer, and we have to redirect them back to the specific questions. So here's an example. What would you consider to be one of your major strengths that would help you with this position? And the applicant responds, I'm very good with people. Well, what does that mean? Um, everybody thinks they're good with people. So when people give a trait answer like that, or just a very general, vague, high-level answer, direct it. Can you give me an example of how you're good with people? And we got some more examples here. Well, I used to be a research assistant at San Francisco General Hospital. Interviewer, can you explain how you used your people skills at San Francisco General Hospital? Applicant, I worked on the stroke surveillance project. I had to conduct in-person interviews with post-discharge stroke patients that could be very challenging. Interviewer, what did you find challenging? Applicant, the patients in the study were elderly, had memory issues from the stroke, and the majority had English as a second language. You can see here how this gives you much more meaningful information to work with. And as a hiring manager, you need to ask only job-related questions. As an applicant, you want to ask how these things are related to the job. And of course, as we know from HIM 210 or other courses that you've taken, or just general adult knowledge, federal and state laws prohibit any questions that may result in identifying an applicant's race, religion, national origin, ancestry, medical condition, marital status, sex, or age. These questions are not relevant as open-ended questions based on past experience, right? Some job-related questions may be either closed-ended, meaning they're yes or no. Like, do you have a current nursing license? Do you have an RHID credential? It's yes or no. That's totally fine. We're not saying don't ever ask closed-ended questions. We just want to use them appropriately. And we need to ask all applicants the same questions if you're a hiring manager. So here's one that has been problematic for a lot of us who have hired nurses and needed bilingual nurses, right? We were hiring sometimes research nurses who need to speak another language because they need to interface with somebody who doesn't have English as a primary language, right? And the second bullet point addresses that. Did you learn to speak Spanish here in the United States, or were you born in Mexico? Where people are born really is not relevant to the workplace, right? More appropriate way to ask it is in the second bullet point on the right. Have you ever worked in a bilingual job where speaking and understanding Spanish was part of the job duties? That's all that matters, right? If you have a need for a bilingual applicant based on your patient population, it is appropriate and legal to ask that, provided you're not asking things that identify where they are originally born from, or if they're a citizen, which we'll get to in a little bit. Another one is, do you have a maiden name? Again, it is appropriate and legal and is definitely consistent with operational needs to ask if somebody has ever worked under another name. Asking if they've ever been married before or if they have a maiden name is not recommended. And then again, since I can say this as somebody who's on the north side of 50, when did you get your BSN? Again, it doesn't really matter, right? Think about what's job related. It's relevant to ask, do you have a current BSN? And now one that is in the news a lot as of late, for better or worse. Are you a citizen? Again, we don't really care who's a citizen and who's not, at least in my opinion, we should. Identifying people by whether they are a citizen or not is not appropriate. It is appropriate. It is legal. In fact, it is required with I-9 documents to ask, do you have the right to work in the United States? That is appropriate. Asking if somebody is a U.S. citizen is definitely not appropriate. Let's take a look at some other ones. Driving and weekend work. Employers need to know whether job applicants can meet job requirements, but they need to be asked in a way that's neutral, consistent, and legally sound. We don't care if somebody has a car. We may need to ask if they have a current driver's license, if they're required to drive from one site to another, right? Another one that we run into is, do you have any religious restrictions or family responsibilities that would prevent you from working weekends? Again, not appropriate. We just need to ask if they're available. We don't care the reason why or why not. It's based on operational needs, not any type of preconceived personal preferences. And again, what I like to do, this is kind of a score sheet, right? Just kind of put some generic job in there. You can do that. I think if you're interviewing a whole lot of applicants for a position, this is helpful. If you're an applicant, you may want to jot something down based on the posting. I have found that to be very, very useful, particularly interviewing for positions that are requiring online work. I'll let you do the walkthrough exercises on your own, but this might be a place for you to practice with your partner, right? So you can see this is very useful, not just for interviewing employees, but setting yourself up to be interviewed. I've used this approach successfully to apply for an online teaching position with Los Angeles Mission College. And again, the steps are very much the same as what I described. Look at the posting, right? And they asked both very open-ended and closed-ended positions. It's very, very helpful to answer these things based on your own past experience. One thing that new graduates and students sometimes ask is, what do I do if I lack experience? Well, one, you should never lie on a resume. You should never exaggerate it. That's one thing that is definitely going to kill your chances of getting a position. However, you may want to look at some of the things that you've done in school, simulations, what types of cases you've coded, for instance, what type of coding and reimbursement classes you've done. So the idea is, even if you don't have formal, regular experience in a certain area, is to tap into some of the specific things that you've taken in your program here at Lane. Anyway, I hope you all find that useful. Please feel free to reach out, comment, or ask any questions about this material. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you online. Bye now.